There is a particular kind of violence that doesn't end with blood. It ends with a story, told, retold, tightened like a knot, until the next generation feel compelled to pull it through. In Old Norse Saga tradition, Ragnar Lothbrok is that story. He's not merely a Viking raider with a reputation. He is a narrative device, a semi-legendary figure assembled from earlier heroic fragments, used to explain how power moves, how dynasties justify themselves, and why vengeance can be made to sound like destiny. Modern scholarship is blunt about the problem. Ragnar is best treated as a semi-legendary composite, not a person whose biography can be read as straightforward history. And yet, the saga world clings to him because it needs him. Ragnar's origins shift depending on which medieval tradition you listen to. The sagas root him in royal lineage and dynastic legitimacy, connections that matter because they turn raiding into inheritance and plunder into right. In other words, Ragnar isn't presented as a random outsider, he is framed as part of a political order that can be traced, claimed, and passed on. The story also gives Ragnar a signature nickname, Lothbrok, Hairy Breeches. And this is not a poetic flourish. It is an etymology, an explanation for why the name exists at all. The sagas attach it to an early ordeal involving a serpent or lindworm. Ragnar survives the threat by using protective clothing, and in so doing, wins a bride. The details are mythic, the storytelling purpose is practical. The saga wants you to believe that Ragnar's later greatness is earned early, under pressure, when the stakes feel lethal. Saga tradition builds Ragnar through episodes rather than chronology. His youth is a sequence of demonstrations. Violent tests, raids, fights, dangerous contests, cunning and fearlessness, surviving what is meant to kill you, and crucially, marriage as politics. This last point is easy to miss if you read the sagas like a modern novel. But in the saga logic, marriage is not a pause from action. It is one of the ways alliances and claims are created, and one of the mechanisms by which legitimate heirs are born. Ragnar's life is structured so that love, violence, and rule are braided together. The sagas are internally inconsistent about exactly which son belongs to which mother, and different versions vary in sequencing and emphasis, so the cleanest way to follow the tradition is not to demand a single rigid family tree, but to treat each marriage as strongly associated with a cluster of sons and episodes, and to flag where the texts don't agree. Lagertha, the Shield-maiden who makes power believable. In Saxo's Gesta Dandorum, Lagertha appears as an almost archetypal Shield-maiden, a woman who fights and commands in battle, in a way that makes the man around her look almost superfluous. Her wooing is narrated as a test. Ragnar must prove himself against dangerous obstacles, and the saga frames her as a ruler who can judge marital worth. A bear and a hound, both set between them like living barriers, become the stage on which Ragnar's courage is confirmed. As for children, in many versions, Björn Ironside is strongly associated with Lagertha, though some traditions swap parentage assignments between Lagertha and Aslaug. That sort of variation is not an accident. It's how the saga tradition reshuffles legitimacy to suit the story it wants to tell in that particular retelling. The main idea Lagertha contributes is Ragnar's lineage gains credibility through a mother who herself embodies command in war. Thóra and the Lindworm ordeal and the logic of Lothbrok. If Lagertha is the saga's battle-credible wife, Thóra Bogahjota is the saga's earned by danger wife. Thóra is presented as guarded by a monstrous serpent or lindworm. Her father's promise is the standard heroic mechanism. The right man wins the right woman by surviving the appointed terror. Ragnar kills the creature and does so in a way explicitly tied to Lothbrok, the protective clothing that helps him endure the serpent's lethal threat. So, hairy breeches. There are hairy trousers covered in pitch or tar and then coated with sand. He lets it harden and then wears them like armor to defeat the serpent or the lindworm. Though he is called Lothbrok, hairy breeches, he also wore a coat made in the same way. Thora's associated sons in the Tale of Ragnar's Sons traditions are commonly given as Erik and Agnar, and the saga places their conflict and deaths within the Swedish dynastic strand. And the main idea Thóra contributes? Ragnar's greatness is portrayed as the outcome of survival under supernatural peril, and his heirs inherit that chosen by danger heroic logic. Aslaug, mythic ancestry and the revenge conquest engine. After Thóra's narrative function is fulfilled, Aslaug enters as the wife whose status is not just noble, but mythic. The sagas treat her as an origin bridge, a character designed to link Ragnar's family line to legendary heroic genealogies, often of a Valsaga-like type. She is the forbidden daughter of Sigurd and Brunhild, who, after both of their deaths in the Valsaga saga, is spirited away and hidden by Heimir. She is then given the name Kraka by Anki and Grimma, who effectively keep her in some kind of Cinderella motif. That move does something very particular. It doesn't merely elevate Aslaug, it elevates her sons by presenting them as near inevitable conquerors, men whose actions can be framed as the unfolding of fates rather than merely the continuation of violence. In the dominant tale of Ragnar's sons tradition, Aslaug is commonly associated with these sons: Ivar the Boneless, Sigurd Snake-in-the-Eye, Hvitserk, and Uba, with the understanding that lists can vary across manuscript strands. And the main idea that Aslaug contributes? Ragnar's legacy, especially the great heathen army era of the saga imagination, is framed as cosmically destined, not just politically convenient. The sagas situate Ragnar's family inside a wider Viking world of raids and political breakdown. But again, what matters is not the modern geographic accuracy, it is the narrative causation. Sweden, family tragedy as war motivation. A Swedish conflict strand associated with Eystein, depending on spelling and version, is used to explain why certain sons die and why later vengeance becomes necessary. In this tradition, Thóra's sons Eric and Agnar are often portrayed as dying within the Swedish conflict, their deaths feeding the moral engine for escalation. England, the saga's decisive link to the great heathen army. The most famous linkage comes when Ragnar's death becomes the trigger for the sons' revenge campaign into England. The sagas claim Ragnar is captured and executed by Northumbrian king, commonly Aella, with the execution method rendered as a snake pit of death. That scene becomes the narrative fuse that lights the later sequence. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records Vikings campaigning in England beginning with a landing in 865 and leading to York in 867, but it does not name Ragnar. Modern historians treat the saga's precise naming as influential literary tradition rather than direct documentary proof. Still, the saga remains compelling because it explains why later memory groups Viking leadership under a single family banner, and the sons, especially Ivar and his brothers, become the saga's usable cast for those broad political events. There is a repeated point to a core difficulty. The sagas do not offer a single stable parentage framework, so this section keeps close to that principle. Mothers are commonly given associations, deaths and roles vary by version. Björn Ironside, often Lagertha associated. Björn is frequently linked with Lagertha in the saga traditions, though some versions tie him to Aslaug instead. He is portrayed as a major war leader and kingly figure, associated with raids and rulership in later saga imaginings, and typically surviving long enough to found lines of power in geographical storytelling. Narrative function: Lagertha's war legitimacy echoes in Björn's rulership. Eric and Agnar, Thóra associated. Eric and Agnar presented as Thóra's sons in the sagas. Their fate is tied to a Swedish conflict, often framed as deaths that precipitate later vengeance. The narrative function: Thóra's tragedy seeds the later revenge momentum. Ivar the Boneless, Aslaug associated. Ivar is arguably the most historically anchored of the saga brothers in the sense that he appears to be connected to real Viking activity in England. Encyclopedia Britannica framing Ivar's leadership role in the English campaign is traditionally reported, but absolute identification of every later detail remains uncertain. His narrative function: Ivar becomes the saga's intelligence and command figure, the one who turns anger into strategy. Sigurd Snake-in-the-Eye, Hvitserk, and Uba, all associated with Aslaug. These brothers are grouped in Aslaug-associated lists and are tied to later campaign participation and revenge logic, but their endings and exact placement in the story vary by version, reinforcing the message saga tradition preserves themes even when it can't preserve one version of events. The most widely transmitted death scene is the one that most identified as central. Ragnar is executed by Ayla in Northumbria by being thrown into a pit of vipers. In saga structure, his death matters because it is not only punishment, it is narrative causation. It sets up the son's vengeance as an almost inevitable sequel. Saxo's chronicle tradition includes Ragnar in a similarly prominent marital framework, which later saga poets then stylize further. The modern problem: strong evidence exists for Viking raids and campaigns in England, but less certainty exists for the saga-specific claims that a single man named Ragnar did exactly what the tradition says, and that his execution occurred in that exact manner. Hence, the snake pit death is treated as a legendary narrative, a story that preserves historical memory while also shaping meaning. The death song that turns vengeance into fate. If Ragnar's execution is the hinge, then Krákumál is the engine that makes the hinge swing smoothly. What is Krákumál? Krákumál is traditionally described as a death song, a skaldic poetic composition presented as associated with Ragnar's final words, preserved and discussed in Old Norse scholarship. The skaldic project provides framing for its place in the skaldic tradition. And the key themes in function: commemoration and defiance. Ragnar meets death with an aura of heroic assurance. A bridge between generations. The poem's voice links Ragnar's life to what his sons will do. Prophecy and fate logic. It frames the son's later actions as the fulfillment of destiny following Ragnar's execution. In short, Krákumál is the storytelling device that reframes family vengeance into an ordered myth of honor, fate, and dynastic continuation. How the saga makes it come true. Within the saga narrative logic, Ragnar dies, the son's revenge campaign escalates, England becomes the stage. The Great Heathen Army sequence, recorded broadly in chronicle tradition, gets interpreted through the saga's geographical lens, so that named brothers can be treated as living fulfillments of what Krákumál implies. It's probably a good idea to mention that the Krákumál, Ragnar's death song, is 29 stanzas long. Krákumál means the Lay of Kraka, or Song of Kraka. This is why I mentioned earlier that Aslaug is renamed Kraka. This is her song, her lay. Maybe they're trying to say that she was just retelling his final words, but then she wouldn't have been there, so someone else told her. It doesn't really work, does it? I mean, why is it not called Aslaugmál or even Ragnarsumal? Kind of weird. Now, when I was doing the research for this video, I came across a mention in the Heimskringla, the lives of the Norse kings, and I felt that I needed to add it here as it's important to what we've been discussing. And that is, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I mean, that could have been the lost 30th stanza of Ragnar's death song. Thanks, Ragnar. Ragnar Lothbrok is remembered in the sagas the way certain leaders are remembered in every tradition. Not because every detail is verifiable, but because the story performs a function. It gives the lineage a reason to exist. It turns war into a kind of inherited argument. Lagertha makes the warrior household credible. Thóra makes Ragnar's nickname and heroism paid for in peril. Aslaug surprise mythic ancestry so the son's future can be felt as destined. Then comes the snake pit death, violent, theatrical, unforgettable. And finally, Krákumál, the death song that does the real work. It makes vengeance feel like prophecy. And that is why Ragnar endures, not as a record, but as a mechanism. A family vendetta, salted with myth, until it hardens into fate.